When the room stood up to applaud Nolan Voss, I did not cry or make a scene. I simply unclipped my badge, left it on the polished wood, and walked out. They had no idea the strategy they were cheering required the three most powerful executives to lose their perks. And they never suspected that in just a few weeks, I would return with the power to decide whose career ends and which department gets cut from the company. My name is Brianna Cook. I am 36 years old, and until exactly 9:15 this morning, I was the senior recovery strategist for Astron Fulfillment Systems. Our corporate headquarters dominated the skyline of St. Louis, a massive tower of glass and steel meant to project an image of untouchable dominance in the logistics sector. But beneath the polished marble lobbies and the high-speed elevators, the company was hemorrhaging cash. The executive board had spent the last 2 years betting the company's future on a completely reckless expansion across the American Southwest. They had signed ironclad leases on millions of square feet of warehouse space in the middle of nowhere and launched dedicated delivery routes that burned through tens of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel just to ship half-empty trucks. It was arrogance masquerading as ambition, and it had pushed the entire operation to the very edge of bankruptcy. For the past 4 months, I had been the only one standing between the executive suite and total financial ruin. I worked myself into a state of near absolute physical exhaustion. I spent 120 consecutive days waking up at 4 in the morning, surviving on black coffee and adrenaline, staring at operational matrices and financial projections until the numbers swam in front of my eyes. I built a comprehensive model to restructure the entire company. I mapped out the immediate closure of 22 unprofitable fulfillment centers. I drew up the termination plans for over 40 bleeding delivery routes. I spent dozens of hours on hostile phone calls with freight carriers, fighting tooth and nail to renegotiate our shipping rates down by 15%. Most importantly, I dismantled our heavily marketed same-day delivery promise, a massive vanity project championed by the executives that was incinerating capital like a blast furnace. I stripped away the ego, did the brutal math, and designed a highly specific, phase-by-phase strategy to stop the bleeding and save the company. This brought us to the most critical meeting in the history of Astron. We were gathered in the main executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. The air conditioning was cranked down freezing cold, but the sheer anxiety radiating from the room made the air feel suffocatingly heavy. Sitting shoulder to shoulder along one side of the massive mahogany table were the heavy hitters, the board of directors, and a grim-faced delegation from the lending consortium that held our debt. They were holding a $200 million note that was dangerously close to default. They had the legal authority to seize our assets and liquidate the company by the end of the week if they did not see a viable path to profitability. Standing confidently at the head of the table, bathed in the crisp blue light of the projector screen, was Nolan Voss. Nolan was our vice president of strategy. He was 39 years old, wore expensive custom-tailored suits, and possessed the kind of deep, smooth baritone voice that made people in power instinctively want to agree with him. Nolan had not built a single spreadsheet during this crisis. He had not negotiated a single contract. He had not lost a single hour of sleep. He had simply spent the last 4 months popping into my office to ask for high-level summaries and executive bullet points so he could present my progress to the board. Yet, there he was, holding the clicker, advancing through the slide deck, my slide deck. He was delivering my recovery strategy, point by point, metric by metric, passing it off with the effortless charm of a man who had conceived the entire master plan in the shower that morning. "We have to immediately cauterize the bleeding in the Southwest Corridor," Nolan said, pacing slowly and making direct eye contact with the lead investor. "By aggressively restructuring our external carrier agreements and executing a surgical reduction of our same-day delivery guarantees, we can stabilize our primary cash flow within 60 days. This model projects a return to baseline profitability by the third quarter." Surgical reduction. That was my exact phrase. I sat 3 chairs down from him, my hands folded quietly in my lap. I did not react. I just watched the faces of the lenders. I watched their rigid, skeptical postures begin to soften. The lead investor, a stern man with silver hair, who had spent the last hour aggressively tapping an expensive pen against his legal pad, finally stopped tapping. He looked up at Nolan, and I saw a glimmer of genuine respect settle into his eyes. This is exactly the kind of ruthless, clear-eyed restructuring we needed to see today. Nolan, the investor said. His voice carried a tone of immense relief. It is a life-saving vision for the company. Frankly, the logic is bulletproof. I waited. My heart beat slowly and steadily against my ribs. This was the moment. This was the standard corporate pivot where the executive formally acknowledges the architect of the work. All Nolan had to do was gesture toward me and say that Brianna Cook was the engine behind the data. It would have cost him absolutely nothing. It was the bare minimum requirement of professional decency. Nolan offered a modest, perfectly practiced smile. "Thank you," he said smoothly. It required a tremendous amount of late nights and hard choices, but I knew we had to find a way to make the numbers work. He accepted the praise. He did not correct the investor. He did not look in my direction. He did not mention my name once. He simply swallowed my 4 months of brutal, grinding labor and claimed it as a testament to his own brilliant leadership. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at my immediate manager, Everett Dane. Everett was the chief operating officer of Asteron. He knew exactly who had built the recovery model. I had emailed him the final locked versions of the spreadsheets at 2 a.m, just 2 days prior. Everett was leaning back in his plush leather chair, taking a slow sip from a crystal glass of water. Our eyes locked. In Everett's gaze, I saw the truth. There was no surprise in his expression. There was no flash of guilt or apology. There was only a cold, silent warning. His eyes told me to keep my mouth shut. His eyes told me to be a good team player and let the men handle the money. In that fraction of a second, the entire architecture of the room became clear to me. This was not an accident. This was not a case of Nolan getting caught up in the excitement and forgetting to give credit. This was a deliberate, calculated corporate decision. Everett and the rest of the executive team had decided that a polished, silver-tongued male vice president fit their desired image of corporate salvation much better than a tired, 36-year-old female strategist sitting quietly on the sidelines. They did not just want my work, they wanted to sanitize its origins. They were serving me up as an invisible ghostwriter to save their own careers. A younger version of myself might have swallowed the humiliation. I might have stayed silent, scheduled a private meeting with Everett later in the week, and gently expressed my disappointment. I might have convinced myself that causing a disruption in front of the lenders would be professional suicide, but sitting in that freezing, airless room, I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to argue or fight for scraps of recognition. I felt nothing but an absolute, crystalline clarity. I pushed my chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped violently against the hardwood floor. It was a harsh, ugly sound that instantly shattered the quiet murmur of approval echoing around the long table. Nolan froze in the middle of his next sentence. The lead investor flinched. Everett went completely rigid, his knuckles turning instantly white around his water glass. Every single pair of eyes in the room snapped toward me. I stood up. I reached up to the lapel of my blazer and unclipped my employee access badge. The plastic backing made a sharp, distinct snap in the dead silence of the room. I reached out and dropped the badge onto the polished mahogany table. It slid a few inches and came to a stop right next to Everett's legal pad. "I quit," I said. My voice was calm, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. "Effective immediately." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one took a breath. Nolan's jaw dropped slightly, his charismatic veneer cracking wide open as panic flooded his eyes. Everett lunged forward in his chair, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Brianna," Everett hissed, keeping his voice dangerously low so he would not panic the lenders sitting just feet away. "Sit down. Now is absolutely not the time for this." I did not look at him. I did not look at Nolan. I did not look at the confused faces of the lending consortium. I picked up my leather notebook, turned my back on the most powerful men in the company, and walked toward the heavy glass doors at the back of the room. I did not rush my steps. I did not stomp or storm out in a fit of dramatic rage. I simply walked away from them, leaving my exhausted labor and their unearned salvation sitting on the wood between them. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the carpeted hallway. The ambient corporate buzz of the executive floor felt completely disconnected from reality, like static on a radio. I walked down the hall in total silence, reached the elevator bank, and pressed the down button. A chime sounded, and the heavy metal doors slid open. I stepped inside and turned around to face the corridor. Through the glass walls of the boardroom 30 yards away, I could see the chaos finally erupting. Everett was on his feet, waving his hands frantically as he tried to speak over the sudden uproar. Nolan was staring blankly at the projector screen, looking completely lost without my notes to guide him. The lenders were all leaning aggressively over the table, demanding answers. As the elevator doors slowly slid closed, cutting off the view of the boardroom, a deep, dark sense of satisfaction settled into my chest. They thought they had secured their survival by silencing me and stealing my strategy. But as the elevator began its long descent to the ground floor, I knew the reality of what I had just done. I had just ignited a total operational collapse, and not a single person in that room had even realized the fuse was burning yet. The drive back to my apartment in the central West End was a blur of gray concrete and morning traffic. I did not turn on the radio. I just listened to the rhythmic thumping of the tires against the pavement. When I finally unlocked my front door and dropped my keys on the counter, the silence of my living room hit me like a physical weight. There was a sudden, violent urge to open my phone, pull up my professional network, and type out a scorching, unfiltered post exposing every single one of them. I wanted the world to know what had just happened. But my fingers froze hovering over the screen. Anger is a cheap fuel. It burns hot and fast, and it usually ends up burning the person holding the match. I put the phone face down on the kitchen island. I poured a glass of cold water, drank it in one breath, and walked over to my home office. I opened my personal laptop and immediately established a secure connection to my localized backups. I knew Astron it would cut my remote server access within the hour, but they were too slow to realize I had spent the last 4 months religiously backing up my raw datasets and email archives to my encrypted local drive. I sat in the glow of the monitor and began to dig. I did not look at the final presentation. Instead, I went backward. I opened my calendar, my meeting minutes, and my draft logs stretching back through the summer and fall. I needed to see how the architecture of their lie had been built. It did not take long for the pattern to emerge, glaringly obvious in hindsight. I pulled up the transcript notes from a strategy alignment meeting held on the second Tuesday of October. I had proposed shifting our regional freight contracts from a fixed rate to a dynamic tier system. The room had been indifferent. My suggestion was met with polite nods and immediate subject changes. Exactly 18 minutes later in that same meeting, Nolan had leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and pitched the exact same dynamic tier concept. He used a slightly deeper register. He paused for dramatic effect. The board members practically fell over themselves praising his innovative leadership. I found dozens of these micro-thefts scattered across my digital paper trail. An optimized picking schedule here. A reduced packaging protocol there. Every time I laid a brick, Nolan waited until the cement was dry, painted his name on it, and collected the applause. But the theft of credit was just petty corporate politics. What I found next in the document version history was something far more sinister. I opened the metadata log for the final recovery model. At 11:45 the night before the presentation, an email had been sent from Nolan to a junior visual designer on the night desk. The instruction was explicit. Nolan had ordered the designer to duplicate the master file, strip all document properties linking back to my user ID, and hardcode his name as the sole author and creator of the file. It was a deliberate, premeditated erasure. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I opened the sterilized version of the deck that Nolan had projected in the boardroom and placed it side by side on my dual monitors with my original, locked master file. I started scrolling through the operational matrices, comparing the columns. Page 24 matched. Page 28 matched. But when I hit the regional breakdown on page 35, my breath caught in my throat. An entire operational pillar had been cleanly excised, the data had been smoothed over, the charts recolored to hide the gap, but the absence was glaring to anyone who knew the math. They had deleted the proposal to close the Dallas North Fulfillment Center. I stared at the screen, my mind racing through the financial implications. Dallas North was a massive, sprawling facility that was bleeding capital at an apocalyptic rate. Its location was strategically useless, its inventory turnover was abysmal, and its labor costs were 25% higher than the regional average. In my original model, liquidating that specific warehouse was the linchpin of the entire recovery. It freed up millions in immediate operating cash. If Dallas North stayed open, the entire recovery strategy I had built became structurally unsound. The diverted funds meant we could not afford to renegotiate the priority shipping lanes. Without the priority lanes, the late delivery penalties would trigger again within 90 days. By saving that one warehouse, Nolan and Everett had effectively guaranteed the model would collapse before the end of the fiscal year. Why would they sabotage their own survival? I opened a new search window and typed in the name of the regional director for the Dallas North facility. The employee directory profile popped up. A man named Gregory Vance. I cross-referenced the name with my archived emails and an old corporate newsletter from 2 years ago, and there it was. A glossy photo of the executive team at a charity golf tournament. Standing next to Everett Dane, laughing and holding a trophy, was his brother-in-law, Gregory Vance. The realization washed over me like ice water. They had not just stolen my work to look good. They had mutilated the strategy to protect a family member. Everett was willing to let the entire logistics network burn rather than cut his wife's brother loose. And Nolan, desperate to secure his promotion to the C-suite, had happily taken a machete to the data to protect Everett's personal interests. They were presenting a fatally flawed financial model to a consortium of furious lenders, legally binding the company to a plan they knew was compromised. My phone began to vibrate violently against the kitchen island. I walked out, picked it up, and looked at the screen. It was Everett. I let it ring out. A minute later, a voicemail notification popped up. I pressed play and put it on speaker. "Brianna, it is Everett." His voice crackled through the speaker, adopting a tone of forced calm that barely masked his panic. "You are being entirely too emotional about this. We value your input, but walking out of a critical investor meeting is highly unprofessional. Call me back immediately. We need to get you back in the building before you throw your entire career away over a simple miscommunication." A simple miscommunication. I deleted the voicemail. A text message appeared a moment later. It was from Nolan. "Hey, Bree," the message read. "Things got pretty intense in there today. I think wires got crossed during the prep phase. I definitely meant to shout out your hard work on the data pull. Let us grab a coffee on Tuesday and smooth things out. Drinks on me." I stared at the message. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. He was offering me a $5 cup of coffee in exchange for 4 months of stolen labor and my silence regarding a fraudulent financial presentation. I did not reply to Everett. I did not reply to Nolan. I set my phone to Do Not Disturb and walked back into my office. This was no longer a matter of a bruised ego. It was not a sad story about a woman being overlooked in a corporate boardroom. They had manipulated financial projections. They had lied to institutional lenders. They had prioritized nepotism over fiduciary duty. And they had used my stolen credibility to do it. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a heavy-duty, 2-terabyte external hard drive. I plugged it into my laptop. I began to drag and drop every single file, every email thread, every data sheet, and every metadata log proving the timeline of the document tampering. I exported the original financial models, clearly highlighting the catastrophic impact of keeping Dallas North operational. The transfer bar slowly filled across the screen, calculating the gigabytes of raw, undeniable proof. My professional intuition, honed over a decade of fixing broken companies, was screaming a single, undeniable truth. This was not going to end with a quiet resignation. When the lenders realized the numbers did not add up, the implosion was going to be biblical, and when the dust settled, Everett and Nolan would need a scapegoat. They would point the finger at the emotional strategist who quit under pressure. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The drive chimed, confirming the transfer was complete. I ejected the drive, disconnected it, and slipped it into the inside pocket of my bag. I was not going to be their scapegoat. I was going to be their reckoning. I woke up the next morning feeling strangely weightless. The suffocating pressure of the executive floor was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of my own refrigerator and the morning light spilling across my kitchen counter. I did not log onto social media to draft a dramatic manifesto about my sudden departure. I poured a cup of black coffee, opened my laptop, and navigated directly to my professional networking profile. I stripped away all the corporate jargon and sanitized the descriptions of my past roles. I updated my resume with cold, hard objectivity. I listed only the projects I had personally salvaged from the brink of failure. I typed out how I had reduced carrier inefficiencies by 22% across the board. I documented the turnaround of the Midwest distribution hub, explicitly noting how I turned a $2 million deficit into a net positive within a 6-month window. I claimed exactly what was mine. Every metric, every recovered dollar, every salvaged supply chain. There was no room for misinterpretation. The sheer precision of the facts felt like wearing armor. 48 hours later, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar New York number. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, feeling a flicker of suspicion, before answering. "Brianna Cook," a woman said. Her voice was sharp and commanding, carrying the clipped cadence of someone whose time was billed by the minute. "My name is Celeste Rowan. I am a managing partner at Rowan & Hayes. I represent Granite Shore Credit Partners." I sat up straight, instantly on guard. Granite Shore was the lead institution in the lending consortium. They were the people sitting across the table in that freezing boardroom when I threw my badge down. "I know who Granite Shore is," I replied evenly. "Good," Celeste said. "Then you know we have a vested interest in the survival of Asteron Fulfillment Systems. And more importantly, we have a vested interest in the person who actually wrote the survival plan. Do you have time for a secure video conference this afternoon?" I agreed. At 2 o'clock, Celeste appeared on my monitor. She was a striking woman in her late 50s, with steel gray hair cut in an immaculate bob and a gaze that felt like it was scanning my home office for weaknesses. She did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. "Let us skip the corporate dance, Brianna," Celeste began, leaning forward so her face filled the frame. The executives in that room might have thought Nolan Voss was the brilliant architect of that restructuring model. But my forensic accounting team is significantly less gullible. We have known your name for a long time. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, though my pulse quickened. Asteron typically preferred Nolan as the public face for strategic initiatives. "They preferred a puppet," Celeste corrected dryly. "But puppets do not write complex operational code, and they certainly do not build dynamic financial forecasting models. We received a preliminary data packet from Everett Dane 3 weeks ago. So, he thought his team had scrubbed the files cleanly, but whoever handled the document transfer forgot to wipe the deeper metadata. We saw the version history. We saw your user identification attached to every single major structural edit for the past 120 days. I nodded slowly. The validation was a sudden, rushing wave, but I kept my guard up. I knew how ruthless institutional lenders could be. "But here's what really caught my attention," Celeste continued, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The version we pulled from the metadata contained a highly detailed, phased shutdown of the Dallas North facility, yet, in the final presentation yesterday, Dallas North was miraculously spared. Can you explain why the single largest financial drain in the entire logistics network was suddenly protected?" My breath hitched. They already knew. The lenders were actively circling the discrepancy. I measured my words with extreme care. I cannot speak to the executive decisions made after my final draft was submitted. I can only tell you that my mathematics prove the company cannot survive without liquidating that specific asset. Celeste smiled. It was a sharp, predatory smile. That is exactly what we concluded. You walked out because they neutered your strategy to protect a personal interest, rendering the entire model useless. Celeste offered to retain me immediately as an independent auditor for Granite Shore. The financial terms she threw out were incredibly lucrative, but a lingering shadow of doubt held me back. Asteron had spent years subtly conditioning me to believe I was strictly a backroom operator, a technician who needed their massive corporate platform to be truly effective. Before I went to war against a billion-dollar logistics empire alongside a team of New York lawyers, I needed to know if my instincts were sharp entirely outside the Asteron ecosystem. I appreciate the offer, Celeste, I said. But before I dive back into the Asteron mess, I need to test the waters on my own terms. Give me 2 weeks. Celeste respected the boundary. Before disconnecting, she casually mentioned a mid-sized retail client in Kansas City that was bleeding cash due to severe inventory mismanagement. She suggested I take a look as an independent consultant, just to keep my tools sharp. I drove to Kansas City the following Monday. The client was a regional home goods chain operating 40 stores across 3 states. Their logistics network was a tangled, chaotic nightmare. I spent 10 days walking the concrete floors of their primary distribution center. The air smelled of damp cardboard and diesel exhaust. I watched forklifts create massive traffic jams in the aisles. I interviewed exhausted floor managers and ran their intake data through my own predictive models. The problem was glaringly obvious to me, yet entirely invisible to their internal management team. They were receiving 70% of their bulk shipments on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This schedule was completely overwhelming their labor force, forcing massive overtime payouts, and causing high-demand inventory to sit on the receiving dock for up to 5 days before being processed. I did not need a team of vice presidents to approve my solution. I did not need Everett Dane policing my tone. I sat in my hotel room and drafted a staggered intake scheduling model. I proposed restructuring their vendor delivery windows to spread the intake evenly across 6 days, tying the receiving schedules directly to real-time point-of-sale data. I presented the findings directly to the retail chain owner. There was no Nolan Voss standing in front of me to steal the credit. It was just my data, my logic, and my voice. The owner reviewed the numbers, saw the immediate logic, and implemented the new schedule the very next morning. By the end of the month, the results were indisputable. The retail chain reduced their warehouse overtime costs by 42%. Their dock-to-shelf time dropped from 5 days to under 12 hours. I had saved them over $300,000 in the first 4 weeks alone. When my first independent consulting fee hit my bank account, I stared at the screen for a long time. The amount was a fraction of the budgets I used to manage at Asteron, but the feeling it brought was entirely different. The money was secondary. What that Kansas City project gave me was an unbreakable foundation of confidence. It was raw, living proof that my mind was the true asset. The corporate logo on the door was irrelevant. I did not need Asteron to be brilliant. I closed my banking application, picked up my phone, and dialed the New York number. "Celeste," I said when she answered. "I am ready. Let us talk about Asteron." Asteron Fulfillment Systems began to bleed out exactly 21 days after I walked out of that boardroom. While I was busy signing 3 new independent consulting contracts and building a quiet fortress of autonomy, Everett and Nolan were back in St. Louis, confidently piloting a sinking ship. They initiated their sanitized version of the restructuring plan to appease the board of directors and create the illusion of decisive action. They shut down 4 minor regional hubs in places like Little Rock and Omaha. These were entirely cosmetic cuts. It was the equivalent of amputating a finger while ignoring a massive arterial hemorrhage in the chest. They stubbornly kept the sprawling Dallas North facility fully operational, and out of sheer vanity, they refused to kill the unprofitable guaranteed next-day delivery routes. They simply could not bear the humiliation of issuing a corporate press release admitting defeat on their flagship service. The mathematics of supply chain logistics, however, do not care about executive vanity. By the third week of the month, the operational shockwaves hit the dispatch floors with devastating force. Because they had closed the regional relay hubs without recalculating the line haul transit times, the entire routing matrix collapsed. Trucks were arriving at the remaining cross-dock facilities 12 hours late. Outbound drivers were timing out under federal highway regulations before they could even finish loading their trailers. The cascading delays triggered a nightmare financial scenario. Asteron held massive contracts with major commercial suppliers, and those contracts contained brutal service-level agreements. When late deliveries spiked by 42% in a single week, the automated financial penalties activated. Asteron was suddenly bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars in breach of contract fines daily. To make matters worse, the fuel expenditures went completely out of control. Since my original routing architecture had been abandoned to keep Dallas North integrated into the network, drivers were running thousands of deadhead miles. They were driving entirely empty trailers across state lines just to reset their routes for the next morning. They were burning diesel at a premium markup while generating zero revenue. I watched the disaster unfold from the safety of my own living room through the encrypted messages pinging on my personal phone. My inside source was Marisol Keene. Marisol was an incredibly sharp regional logistics director who managed the Southwest Territory. We had spent countless hours in the trenches together building the original data sets. She knew exactly what I had designed. She knew why it had to be implemented perfectly. And she knew exactly what Nolan was currently destroying. "It is an absolute bloodbath down here," Marisol texted me late one Tuesday evening. "The dock supervisors are threatening a wildcat strike. We have trailers sitting in the yard for 4 days because we do not have the labor budget to unload them." Nolan called an emergency containment meeting this morning. He is completely panicking. The board is breathing down his neck, asking for granular unit cost breakdowns, and he literally cannot answer a single question without staring at his junior analysts. A few minutes later, an encrypted file dropped into our secure chat. It was a scanned copy of the internal minutes from Nolan's emergency meeting. I opened the document and scanned the transcript. When asked by the Finance Committee why the transportation costs were 30% over the projected target, Nolan had stammered through a pathetic corporate word salad before finally landing on his carefully constructed excuse. The initial framework we were working with was simply too academic. Nolan was quoted as saying in the official record, "It relied on theoretical routing efficiencies that do not translate to the chaotic reality of the highway. We are currently right-sizing the strategy to account for practical friction." Too academic. I stared at those two words until the screen blurred. It was the ultimate coward's defense. He had stolen my work, mutilated it to protect a crony, broken the entire supply chain, and was now subtly blaming the ghost of the woman who had actually done the math. He was implying that my lack of practical field experience was the root cause of the crisis, entirely ignoring the undeniable fact that he had ripped the central load-bearing pillar out of the foundation by saving his boss's brother-in-law. There was a sharp, biting irony to his excuse. On that exact same day, I had just finished implementing a miniature version of that exact same academic framework for a regional auto parts distributor in Chicago. I had applied the exact same load balancing principles I had designed for Asteron. The Chicago client had executed my plan without altering a single variable, trusting the math over their own egos. Within 14 days, their freight costs had dropped by 18%, and their on-time delivery rate had climbed to 99%. The contrast was a profound, grounding revelation. The problem at Asteron had never been my competence. My formulas were airtight. My logic was flawless. The problem was the rot inside the executive suite. Everett and Nolan desperately wanted the financial salvation my brain could provide, but they absolutely refused to pay the toll that truth demanded. They wanted the cure, but they refused to swallow the bitter medicine of accountability. They believed they could outsmart mathematics with corporate spin and confident hand gestures. By the final week of the month, the internal panic at Asteron began to leak into the broader industry whisper network. Supply chain vendors talk. Freight brokers talk. When a giant logistics firm like Asteron starts delaying invoice payments to its secondary carriers by 45 days, the scent of blood hits the water fast. Marisol called me from her car during her commute home on a Friday evening. Her voice sounded thin and exhausted, entirely stripped of its usual fiery energy. "They are bringing down the hammer. Brianna," Marisol said, the background noise of highway traffic buzzing through the speaker. "The rumor mill on the executive floor is spinning out of control." Granite Shore. Credit Partners just sent a formal notice of default warning. They are not asking for updated slide decks or executive summaries anymore. The lenders have officially lost their patience. They are demanding that Asteron open the raw operational ledgers. They want third-party forensic auditors inside the building by next week to review every single operational decision made in the last 30 days. A cold thrill ran down my spine. The artificial dam Everett had built was cracking under the immense pressure. The lenders were no longer willing to listen to Nolan's smooth baritone voice. They wanted to see the blood, the bone, and the raw data. "What is Everett doing to handle the breach?" I asked quietly. "He is locking down the executive floor," Marisol replied, sounding disgusted. "They revoked access to the shared operational drives for anyone below a vice president level. They are terrified of what the auditors are going to find when they look at the Dallas North expenditures. Everett thinks he can stonewall them with legal red tape and stall the investigation until the next quarter." "You cannot stonewall the people who own your debt," I said, leaning back in my chair and staring at the ceiling. "Once Granite Shore gets into the servers, they will see the massive discrepancies in the routing costs immediately. They will see that Dallas North is eating the capital." "I know," Marisol sighed heavily. "It feels like standing on the deck of a sinking ship and watching the captain argue with the ocean. I am updating my resume this weekend. I cannot go down with this place." "Keep your head down, Marisol," I advised, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Do exactly what they ask. Document every instruction they give you in writing, and do not offer any opinions. Let them own this completely." We ended the call. I walked over to my office window and looked out at the city lights of St. Louis. The board of directors at Asteron was about to discover that the life-saving strategy they had applauded was a hollow shell. They were about to realize they had bet the survival of a billion-dollar company on a man who could not even calculate a fuel surcharge without my help. The house of cards was collapsing exactly as I had modeled it would. But I knew Granite Shore was not just going to send in a team of faceless accountants. Celeste Rowan did not play standard corporate defense. She was going to demand a surgeon who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. And I was already holding the scalpel. The call from Celeste Rowan arrived precisely at 9 in the morning on a Thursday. I was sitting in my newly organized home office, drinking my second cup of coffee and reviewing a supply chain contract for a prospective client in Chicago, when the New York number illuminated my phone screen. I answered on the second ring. "We are done waiting for Asteron to explain their own bleeding," Celeste announced. Her voice was as sharp and uncompromising as ever. "The executive board just missed another crucial covenant threshold. The lending consortium held an emergency vote late last night. We are stepping in, and I want you leading the charge." I set my coffee mug down slowly. "Leading it in what capacity?" "Celeste, I am not walking back into that building as an employee just to fix Nolan Voss's catastrophic mistakes." "You are not going back as an employee," Celeste replied, a distinct edge of grim satisfaction in her tone. "Granite Shore Credit Partners wants to retain you as an independent restructuring advisor. You will be acting directly on behalf of the creditors. We are giving you full access to the corporate data room. Your mandate is singular and absolute. You are going to evaluate the current wreckage and tell us whether Asteron fulfillment systems should be thrown a lifeline, broken into pieces and sold off for scrap assets, or placed under the strict, punitive supervision of a creditor trust." The silence in my office felt electric. This was the massive, defining pivot I had been waiting for. The entire architecture of power had just inverted. I was no longer the exhausted, invisible strategist sitting quietly in the corner of a freezing boardroom. hoping the men in charge would throw me a scrap of professional recognition. I was now the person they would have to answer to. I was being handed the authority to decide if the company that had tried to erase me even deserved to exist. "Send over the contract and the data room credentials," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "I will start pulling the files this afternoon." By 2 o'clock, the secure login tokens arrived in my encrypted inbox. I booted up my primary workstation, entered the rotating passwords, and breached the Granite Shore server. The virtual data room was a massive repository of every single financial document, loan agreement, and executive communication Asteron had legally been forced to surrender to their lenders over the past month. I bypassed the standard profit and loss statements and drove straight into the heart of the matter: the recent loan modification requests. I needed to see exactly what Everett Dane and Nolan Voss had submitted to the bank to justify their continued existence. I opened a file labeled as a formal request for a 6-month covenant extension. It was dated just 4 days after my resignation. I began to read through the executive summary, my eyes scanning the dense financial legalese. Suddenly, my breath caught in my throat. There, embedded in the core of the legal application, was my entire recovery strategy. They had copied my methodologies, my routing algorithms, and my cost reduction matrices word for word. But that was not the discovery that made my blood run cold. Under the section detailing the operational leadership responsible for designing and executing this critical turnaround, Nolan Voss was listed as the sole architect. The document explicitly guaranteed to the lenders that Nolan possessed the distinct technical expertise and the historical data knowledge required to pilot the company through the crisis. Everett Dane had signed the bottom of the page as the guaranteeing executive officer. The gravity of what I was looking at shifted the entire landscape of my retaliation. This was no longer just a pathetic case of corporate plagiarism or a toxic human resources issue. When you lie to your colleagues about who built a spreadsheet, you are a terrible manager. But when you submit a legally binding document to a consortium of institutional lenders, securing a multi-million-dollar loan extension based on the fabricated technical competence of a key executive, you have crossed a very dark, very severe legal boundary. It was material misrepresentation. It was financial fraud. The creditors had based a massive financial decision on a portrait of leadership that was entirely fictional. A sudden, overwhelming wave of vindication washed over me, but I immediately clamped down on it. I did not rush to the phone to call Celeste. I did not print the document and mail it to the board of directors. Amateur revenge is loud, fast, and sloppy. Professional destruction requires immense patience. If I wanted to surgically remove these men from their positions of power, I had to ensure the truth emerged in a way that was absolutely undeniable, presented directly to the people who controlled their bonuses, their equity, and their employment contracts. I began a methodical, exhausting forensic cross-examination of the data room. I spent the next 72 hours comparing every single document version, every email timestamp, and every operational approval signature. I needed to build a perfect, airtight timeline. I had to cleanly separate the sheer, staggering incompetence of Nolan from the calculated, malicious cover-up orchestrated by Everett. The paper trail was remarkably clear once you knew where to look. I found a series of internal approval chains regarding the Dallas North Fulfillment Center. The documents showed Nolan blindly signing off on routing changes he clearly did not understand, his digital signature stamped on contradictory operational orders within hours of each other. He was just a terrified man pushing buttons in the dark, but Everett's fingerprints were entirely different. I found buried email threads where Everett deliberately redirected regional budget allocations to artificially inflate the apparent profitability of Dallas North. He had intentionally bypassed the standard auditing software to hide the bleeding from the finance committee. Everett was not incompetent. He was actively mutating the corporate strategy to protect his brother-in-law's warehouse and, by extension, his own lucrative year-end bonus tied to regional footprint retention. While I spent my nights dissecting the crimes of my former employers, I spent my days building my own fortress. I formally incorporated my consulting business under the name Cook Recovery Advisory. I leased a small but highly secure office space downtown, deliberately choosing a building with a direct view of the Astron Tower. The irony was not lost on me. I used the capital from my initial consulting successes to aggressively expand my operational capacity. I hired a brilliant, razor-sharp legal assistant to help me navigate the complex compliance structures of corporate debt. 2 days later, I brought on a former forensic data specialist, a quiet woman who could crack open encrypted supply chain databases faster than anyone I had ever met. We were a small team, but we were lethal, built specifically to dismantle the kind of corporate rot currently destroying Asteron. I sat at my new desk on a Friday afternoon, watching the name Cook Recovery Advisory being stenciled onto the frosted glass of my office door. I felt a profound sense of grounding. The anger that had burned inside me when I walked out of that freezing boardroom had entirely evaporated, replaced by cold, hard purpose. I understood now that the ultimate revenge would never be a bitter social media post or a dramatic screaming match in a hallway. The best retaliation was not proving they were wrong to underestimate me. The best retaliation was the moment I would walk back into their lives, not as a subordinate begging for credit, but as the apex predator in a financial ecosystem they could no longer control. I was going to sit at the head of the table, and I was going to hold their professional lives in the palm of my hand. And the most beautiful part of it all was that they had absolutely no idea I was coming for them. It had been exactly 5 weeks and 2 days since I walked out of the Astron Tower. I was sitting at my desk at Cook Recovery Advisory when my direct line rang. The caller identification flashed Everett Dane's private cell number. I did not pick it up immediately. I let it ring 4 times. I listened to the electronic chime echo in my quiet, perfectly controlled office, letting the silence stretch just long enough to establish exactly who was operating on whose schedule. "Brianna," Everett said the moment I finally answered. His voice was completely unrecognizable from the man I had last spoken to. The patronizing warmth he used to deploy like a weapon was entirely gone. The arrogant executive bark that usually echoed down the polished hallways of the 42nd floor had vanished. He sounded like a man who had not slept in 3 days, his words hollowed out by a profound, creeping panic. Astron was sitting millimeters away from a catastrophic breach of their loan covenants, and he knew it. "I am glad you picked up. I have 3 minutes. Everett," I replied. My tone was flat and entirely devoid of empathy. I spoke to him exactly the way a debt collector speaks to a chronic defaulter. "What do you want?" He took a shallow breath and tried to wrap his absolute desperation in soft corporate speak. He told me the board of directors felt my sudden departure had left an unfortunate gap in the continuity of the recovery phase. He said they were hoping to bring me back on a temporary basis for what he called transitional support. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to disguise the fact that they were drowning in their own incompetence and desperately needed the very person they had shoved off the boat. "We value your historical knowledge of the data, Brianna," Everett pleaded, the exhaustion bleeding right through his forced professionalism. "The implementation has hit some unexpected friction points in the field. We need you back in the building to help smooth out the transition. Name your salary. We will bump your previous title up to senior director, effective retroactively." I listened to his entire pitch without interrupting. When he finally stopped talking, the dead silence on my end of the line forced him to hold his breath. He was waiting for me to negotiate. He was waiting for me to express gratitude for the promotion. "I am not coming back as an employee, Everett," I said. My voice was calm, cold, and razor sharp. "I do not want a title, and I do not want a salary. If I step foot inside that building again, I do so exclusively as an external consultant, and my terms are absolute." "Okay," Everett said quickly, swallowing his pride. "Tell me what you want." "First," I stated, enunciating every single word so there could be zero misunderstanding, "I will have unfettered, direct access to the board of directors. I will not report to you, and I will not report to the executive suite. Second, my contract will explicitly state, in writing, that I am the sole author and architect of the original recovery strategy. Third, I am granted full authority to review, audit, and override any operational decisions made by your team since the day I resigned. And fourth, Nolan Voss will be physically present in every single major strategy meeting I conduct. Everett hesitated at the last demand. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Brianna, Nolan is incredibly busy managing the regional fallout right now. Is his presence absolutely necessary for these meetings? It is mandatory, I replied. I did not want Nolan in the room so I could humiliate him immediately. That would be a waste of energy. I wanted him in the room so he could never again serve as a convenient filter between my words and the board's ears. I wanted him pinned to his chair, completely unable to twist my data into his own corporate safety net. If I spoke, he was going to sit there and listen. Fine, Everett agreed. He said it far too quickly. I will have the legal department draw up the paperwork by 5 o'clock today. His immediate surrender triggered an absolute red alert in my mind. A man like Everett Dane did not just hand over the keys to the castle without a hidden angle. He was agreeing to my aggressive terms because he was planning to use my signature as a massive public relations life raft. He wanted to parade my name in front of Granite Shore credit partners to prove he had the situation under control. He fully intended to sign whatever I wanted, corral me once I was back inside the Astron ecosystem, and manipulate the board behind closed doors just as he always had. He thought he was dealing with the Brianna Cook from 5 weeks ago. He had no idea I already held the master key to his destruction. To neutralize his trap, I refused to sign the standard vendor paperwork his legal team sent over. Instead, my own legal assistant drafted a completely new agreement. The paying client was Astron, but the consulting entity was Cook Recovery Advisory. Furthermore, I inserted a lethal compliance clause that Astron had no leverage to refuse. The contract stipulated that Celeste Rowan, alongside an independent restructuring controller of her choosing, would be granted full observer status in all my strategic meetings inside the headquarters. Everett tried to fight that specific clause, citing internal confidentiality, but I reminded him that Granite Shore already owned his debt, and therefore, they owned his secrets. He folded within 20 minutes. On paper, it looked like a highly specialized emergency consulting agreement. In reality, it was a legally binding ticket straight back to the scene of the crime. It was my guaranteed re-entry into the exact room where guilt, cowardice, greed, and my stolen talent had been swapped in the dark. Now, I was walking back in with the power to turn on all the lights. The night before my scheduled return to the Astron headquarters, I sat alone in my office until 2 in the morning. I was not nervous. I did not feel a single drop of anxiety. I felt the cold, terrifying calm of a surgeon reviewing medical charts before a critical, life-saving amputation. I poured a glass of water, opened my primary workstation, and began to build 2 entirely separate strategic frameworks. The first framework was the salvation model. It was the brutal, mathematically honest path to saving the company. It required immediately liquidating the Dallas North facility, breaking the disastrous regional carrier leases Nolan had signed, and completely cleaning house in the executive suite. It was a blueprint for survival, but it was entirely contingent on the board of directors accepting the truth and swallowing the poison of their own mistakes. The second framework was the liquidation model. It was a methodical, ruthless set of instructions to carve Asteron fulfillment systems into profitable regional pieces. It detailed exactly which warehouse clusters to sell off to competitors, how to auction the logistics fleet, and how to dissolve the corporate entity to ensure the creditors got their money back. This was the trigger I would pull if the executive board tried to put on a play, if Everett tried to shield his brother-in-law again, or if anyone in that building thought they could lie to my face one more time. I saved both files to my encrypted drive. I closed my laptop, packed my briefcase, and turned off the lights in my office. The men who ran Astron thought they were hiring a consultant to fix their math. They did not realize they had just invited their executioner inside the gates. The chessboard had completely flipped, and tomorrow, I was making the first move. I stepped through the revolving glass doors of the Astron headquarters on a Tuesday morning, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal wool suit. For 3 years, I had walked across this exact expanse of polished Italian marble as a ghost. I was the invisible technician who arrived before dawn and left long after the sun had set. The security guards had rarely bothered to make eye contact when I swiped my standard employee badge. Today was entirely different. As I approached the front desk, the head of corporate security was already waiting. He handed me a heavy, gold-trimmed visitor pass with the word consultant printed in bold black letters. He did not ask me to sign the guest log. He simply escorted me to the private executive elevator, scanning his master keycard to send me directly to the 42nd floor. The door slid open to reveal a space I used to enter with a quiet sense of dread. But now, the heavy silence of the executive suite felt like my own personal hunting ground. They had set up my temporary command center in a massive corner boardroom overlooking the city. Everett Dane was conspicuously absent, leaving his administrative assistant to show me in. The moment I booted up my secure laptop and connected directly to the master server, I bypassed the sanitized reports Everett's team had prepared for my arrival. I went straight into the raw, unfiltered warehouse management system. I needed to see the bleeding at the Dallas North facility with my own eyes. It took me less than 3 hours to realize the reality was infinitely dirtier than the financial projections indicated. The executives had not just kept a money-losing warehouse open. They were actively cooking the books. I cross-referenced the physical intake scans against the quarterly asset ledger and found a massive, glaring anomaly. Dallas North was holding tens of thousands of units of dead inventory. These were damaged goods, obsolete electronics, and expired seasonal products that should have been written off months ago. Instead, someone in local management had manually overridden the system, reclassifying the garbage as active, sellable stock. By burying this dead weight on the balance sheet, they were artificially inflating the company's total asset value by millions of dollars. They were lying to the board, lying to the shareholders, and lying to the creditors just to keep the quarterly numbers from triggering a total financial panic. Right around noon, the heavy oak door creaked open, and Nolan Voss strolled in. He was wearing a navy blazer and his trademark charismatic smile, though it looked brittle around the edges. He carried 2 cups of expensive coffee, extending one toward me as if we were old friends reuniting after a long weekend. "Brianna," Nolan said, his smooth baritone voice echoing slightly in the large room. "It is genuinely great to have you back in the trenches with us. We have a lot of ground to cover, but I know together we can right the ship." I did not take the coffee. I kept my eyes fixed on my dual monitors. "Sit down, Nolan. We are going to talk about routing architecture." He blinked, the smile faltering as he slowly lowered the cups onto the table and took a seat across from me. "I am looking at the current dispatch logs for the Southwest Corridor," I began, my tone entirely clinical. "Since you are the documented architect of this recovery phase, I need you to explain the dynamic routing logic you implemented for the 75201 postal cluster. Specifically, I want to know why the profit threshold algorithms were disabled for weekend line hauls, causing a 40% spike in deadhead mileage." Nolan stared at me. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked like a student who had walked into an advanced calculus final having never attended a single class. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the door. "Well, the practical friction in that region required a more flexible approach," Nolan stammered, pulling out the same empty buzzwords he had used to placate the board. "We had to pivot away from the academic models to ensure driver retention. That is not a mathematical answer." "Nolan," I cut in, my voice cold and sharp, "the algorithms are automated. Someone had to manually authorize the system override. Since your signature is on the final approval document from 3 weeks ago, tell me the exact cost-benefit equation you used to justify bleeding fuel money to protect an unprofitable postal cluster." He swallowed hard. The silence in the room became agonizing. "Everett felt we needed to maintain presence in that territory," he finally whispered, his charismatic facade entirely shattered. I simply executed his strategic directive. He was a hollow suit. He had stolen my genius, paraded it as his own, and the moment he was asked to actually drive the machine, he crashed it. He had signed his name to operational changes he fundamentally did not comprehend, simply because Everett told him to do it. I dismissed Nolan a few minutes later, leaving him to sweat through his tailored shirt. I picked up my phone and dialed a secure line to a trusted regional operations manager out in Texas. I needed to know why Everett was willing to commit financial fraud to protect the Dallas North facility. The manager hesitated at first, but when I mentioned the Granite Shore audit, the truth spilled out. Months before the crisis hit, Asteron had purchased a massively expensive automated sorting system for Dallas North. The installation had been an unmitigated disaster, plagued by software bugs and mechanical failures. But more importantly, the successful deployment of that specific automation project was contractually tied to the year-end performance bonuses of the top 3 executives, including Everett Dane. If Dallas North was closed, the automation project would be officially declared a failure. Everett would lose a guaranteed cash payout in the high 6 figures. He had crippled a billion-dollar supply chain, manipulated institutional lenders, and thrown me to the wolves, all to protect his own personal bank account. As I sat there digesting the sheer scale of the corruption, I began to reevaluate the board of directors. I had assumed they were a unified cabal of greedy enablers. But looking at the manipulated asset ledgers, I realized several key board members were actually flying blind. They were making critical votes based on heavily doctored slide decks prepared by Everett and presented by Nolan. They were victims of the same polished deception. Late in the afternoon, a woman walked into the boardroom. She did not knock. She closed the door firmly behind her and locked it. It was Delia Hart, the director of internal corporate compliance. She was a brilliant, no-nonsense attorney who had always kept to herself. Delia walked over to the table and dropped a thick, unlabeled manila folder onto the wood. "I heard you were pulling the Dallas North inventory logs," Delia said quietly. Her eyes locked onto mine. "You are looking in the right place, but you are only seeing half the blood. Everett has been using people like you and me as consumable materials for a decade. He finds raw talent, drains it dry, paints the achievements onto the men he plays golf with, and discards the rest of us when we ask for what we earned." I opened the folder. Inside were printed email chains from Everett's private internal server. They were communications between Everett and the Human Resources Department, discussing how to systematically suppress the promotion tracks for female strategists while accelerating the titles of male colleagues who possess the right corporate image. "Why are you giving me this, Delia?" I asked, looking up at her. "Because I am sick of cleaning up his messes," she replied, her voice thick with contained fury. "And because you are the first person to ever walk back into this building holding the detonator." I looked down at the documents, feeling a profound, terrifying clarity settle into my bones. The parameters of my revenge had just irrevocably changed. I was no longer interested in simply exposing Nolan Voss as a brazen, pathetic fraud. He was just a symptom of a much deeper disease. My target had expanded. I was going to tear down the entire corrupt architecture that nurtured, protected, and rewarded this kind of corporate theft. I was going to burn the boys' club to the ground. Delia Hart did not simply provide me with a few isolated documents. She handed me the master keys to the corporate panopticon. Over the next 48 hours, we turned the temporary corner boardroom into a forensic laboratory. We locked the heavy oak doors, drew the mechanized window shades, and systematically dismantled the digital architecture of the executive suite. Delia used her administrative compliance clearance to bypass the standard security protocols, allowing us to pull the archived meeting logs, the hidden calendar invites, and the unedited version histories directly from the central server. We were no longer just looking at the final crime. We were watching the theft happen in slow motion. I tracked the exact minute Nolan downloaded my preliminary drafts. I watched the server logs record him opening the files, highlighting my strategic frameworks, and pasting them into his own blank templates. It was a methodical, almost lazy plundering. But the most devastating piece of evidence did not come from a spreadsheet. It came from a hidden audio file. Astron used a premium video conferencing software that automatically recorded internal strategy sessions unless manually disabled by the host. Nolan, in his supreme technical ignorance, had forgotten to toggle the setting off during our final dry run the Thursday before the fateful board meeting. Delia found the encrypted file buried in a temporary cloud folder. We hit play, and the crisp audio filled the quiet boardroom. "Brianna, I need you to pause right here." Nolan's recorded voice echoed from my laptop speakers. He sounded nervous, entirely stripped of the booming baritone he used in front of the board. "If they ask me about the inverse ratio regarding the cubic foot density and the regional line haul costs, how exactly do I articulate that the math on page 22 is incredibly dense? Can you give me a simpler soundbite?" "The metric is not designed to be a soundbite, Nolan," my own recorded voice replied, sounding exhausted but patient. "It proves that operating the secondary lanes on weekends actively burns capital. You just need to walk them through the variable fuel surcharge." Right, Nolan muttered on the tape, clearly not understanding a word of the formula. "Just write down a 2-sentence summary I can memorize for that slide. I do not want to get bogged down in the academic weeds if the lenders start pressing for details." I reached out and stopped the playback. The silence in the room was heavy. 4 days after that recording, Nolan had stood in front of the lending consortium, pointed to that exact same slide, and presented the density ratio as his own brilliant, groundbreaking realization. Hearing the raw proof of his incompetence out loud was sharp and vindicating, but it was nothing compared to what we found next. Delia pulled up a chain of deleted emails retrieved from the executive exchange server. It was an exchange between Everett Dane and the head of investor relations, dated 2 weeks before the presentation. They were finalizing the guest list for a highly exclusive, private dinner with the Granite Shore Credit Partners delegation. "We need to trim the attendee list for the Tuesday evening dinner." Everett had written, "Remove Brianna Cook from the reservation. While her data compilation is adequate, we need a face more suited for high-level conversation in the room. Nolan Voss will attend in her place to discuss the strategic vision. We cannot risk the lenders getting bogged down by a backroom technician lacking the proper executive polish. A face more suited for high-level conversation." It was a masterclass in corporate venom, dressed up in the polite, sterile language of a calendar update. He was not just stealing my labor, he was actively hiding my existence because I did not fit his aesthetic requirement for leadership. He wanted the meal my brain had cooked, but he absolutely refused to let me sit at the table. I pushed the printed email aside, my jaw tightening. He excluded me on purpose so the lenders would only ever associate the strategy with Nolan. "Keep digging," Delia said, sliding another thick stack of paper across the table. "Because the vanity is just the cover story. Look at the preliminary compensation drafts for the 4th quarter." I opened the document. It was a highly confidential spreadsheet outlining the year-end bonus structures for the C-suite. My eyes scanned down the rows until I hit the operational milestones. There it was, spelled out in undeniable black and white. The threshold for Everett Dane and 2 other senior executives to unlock a massive financial payout was explicitly tied to the footprint retention of the regional network. If the Dallas North facility remained operational through the final day of the fiscal year, Everett would trigger a bonus of over $400,000. The entire automated sorting project he had championed, the one currently failing miserably and bleeding cash, would be officially classified as a transitional success, purely based on the facility remaining open. He had taken a scalpel to my survival model and severed the main artery simply to guarantee his own massive payout. "We have them," I said quietly, the weight of the evidence grounding me. "This is a straight line from plagiarism to financial fraud." Delia leaned against the edge of the conference table, crossing her arms. Her expression was grim. "You only have half the picture, Brianna. Everett knows the walls are closing in. He knows Granite Shore is demanding blood, and he is already building his lifeboat." She pulled a single, unlabeled flash drive from her pocket and plugged it into my workstation. A drafted internal memorandum appeared on the screen, slated to be sent to the board of directors and the lending consortium the following Monday. I read the opening paragraph, and my blood ran ice cold. Everett was entirely throwing Nolan to the wolves. The memorandum painted a tragic, carefully constructed narrative of a rogue vice president. Everett claimed that Nolan Voss had drastically overstated his own contributions to the recovery model, misleading the executive team and misappropriating credit from his subordinates. Everett explicitly stated that Nolan had acted alone in altering the Dallas North projections due to a severe misunderstanding of the data. To complete the illusion of accountability, Everett concluded the memo by humbly accepting a formal reprimand for loose management oversight. He was going to fire Nolan in a spectacular public sacrifice, apologize for trusting the wrong man, and remain safely in his seat of power, his bonus completely intact. I stared at the screen, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the plan crystallizing in my mind. If I let this specific scenario play out, Nolan would certainly fall. He would be disgraced and terminated. But the vile, deceitful system that had produced him would survive completely untouched. Everett would simply replace Nolan with another well-dressed, compliant puppet, and next year, another brilliant, exhausted woman would have her work stolen in the dark. If Everett survives this, I said, my voice hardening into steel, he wins. The company rots from the inside out. The creditors eventually lose their money, and nothing actually changes. So, Delia asked, a fierce, challenging light in her eyes, what are you going to do? I am going to perform an autopsy, I replied. While the patient is still breathing. I spent the entire night before the final, mandatory meeting locked inside my apartment. I did not sleep. I drank black coffee and built 2 completely distinct sets of presentation slides. The first slide deck was the pure, unadulterated salvation architecture. It was the brutal mathematics required to drag Astron back from the edge of bankruptcy. It detailed the immediate closure of the bleeding warehouses, the aggressive renegotiation of the carrier rates, and the true cost of survival. It was the brilliant, airtight model they had desperately wanted to own. The second slide deck was the blade. It contained the server logs, the audio transcripts, the exclusionary emails, and the bonus drafts. It was a surgical, undeniable map of the corruption. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt exactly who the thief was, who the shield was, who the ultimate beneficiary was, and the catastrophic financial price the company had paid for their collective greed. I was not going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow just to fix their broken supply chain. I was going to force the board of directors and the lending consortium to look directly at the rot. I was going to prove that Astron fulfillment systems only deserved to be saved if the truth was finally violently dragged into the light. It was exactly 8 in the morning when I stepped off the elevator onto the 42nd floor. The ambient noise of the corporate headquarters had fundamentally changed overnight. The usual frantic energy, the loud, confident phone calls echoing down the hallways, the brisk footsteps of executives rushing between meetings, all of it had vanished. It was replaced by a thick, suffocating dread. You could literally feel the atmospheric pressure drop the moment you entered the suite. The administrative assistants were speaking in hushed, nervous whispers, their eyes darting toward the closed doors. The heavy oak doors of the corner offices were pulled firmly shut, locking the panic inside. Everyone in the building could sense that the floor was about to give way, even if they did not know exactly where the structural cracks had started. I walked toward the executive pantry to pour a cup of black coffee before the bloodletting began. I needed the bitter taste to ground me. As I reached for a ceramic mug, a shadow fell over the counter. Nolan Voss stepped out from behind the frosted glass partition, effectively blocking the exit. He looked absolutely awful. The bespoke navy suit he wore seemed to hang loosely on his frame, as if he had shrunk inside it. His polished, effortless charisma had entirely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, hollow man with dark circles under his eyes. "Brianna," Nolan said. His voice lacked its usual booming resonance. It was a tight, trembling whisper. "We need to talk before you go into that room. We have nothing to discuss, Nolan," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on my coffee cup as the dark liquid filled the rim. I did not step back. I did not give him a single inch of physical space. "Please," he urged, stepping closer, desperately trying to project a sense of shared camaraderie that made my skin crawl. "Do not take things too far today. If you blow this out of proportion, the creditors will panic. It is not just about me or Everett anymore. Hundreds of warehouse workers could lose their jobs if the board loses confidence in the leadership. We have to be team players right now. You have to think about the collateral damage." He was actually trying to weaponize my empathy. He was using the livelihoods of blue-collar workers to shield his own incompetence. I stopped stirring my coffee. I placed the silver spoon on the counter with a soft, deliberate clink. I turned slowly and looked directly into his panicked eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single drop of anger leak into my tone. "When the investors called the strategy a life-saving masterpiece," I asked, my words cutting through the quiet room like a surgical blade, "why did you not say my name?" Nolan froze. His jaw worked silently, opening and closing, but absolutely no sound came out. He had likely spent the entire night preparing a dozen different corporate excuses, legal justifications, and emotional appeals, but he had absolutely no defense against the raw, naked truth. He stood there, entirely paralyzed by his own cowardice. I did not wait for his answer. I picked up my mug and walked past him, leaving him standing alone in the pale fluorescent light. Halfway down the main corridor, Everett Dane's private office door swung open. He stepped out, his eyes locking onto me instantly. "A brief word, in my office," Everett instructed. It was phrased as a polite request, but the underlying tone was a desperate, heavy command. I stepped inside. He closed the heavy door securely behind us and engaged the brass lock. The electronic window blinds were already drawn, casting the large room in a dim, defensive shadow. Everett walked behind his massive mahogany desk but did not sit down. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the leather blotter, trying to project total control. "I know you are angry," Everett began, adopting the smooth, reasonable tone of a seasoned hostage negotiator. "And you have every right to be frustrated. Mistakes were made in the chain of communication during the initial rollout, but today is about saving Asteron. I have spoken privately with the compensation committee this morning. We are prepared to double your current consulting fee immediately. Furthermore, once the dust settles and the loan covenants are secured, I can guarantee you a position as Executive Vice President of Strategy. It comes with a 7-figure compensation package, full stock options, and you will report directly to me." He paused, letting the immense weight of the money hang in the dead air of the room. He was watching my face, waiting for the greed to override my principles. "All you have to do," he continued softly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is walk into that boardroom and focus exclusively on the recovery model. We look forward, not backward. We do not need to confuse the creditors by digging into who edited which file or who attended which dinner last month. We present a unified front. We secure the loan extension today, and you get exactly what you have always deserved." I looked at him, truly seeing the absolute void where his professional integrity should have been. He was not protecting Asteron. He was not even protecting Nolan, the man he had propped up to steal my intellectual property. He was entirely willing to sacrifice anyone, bury any truth, and burn any bridge to ensure he remained in his seat of power. He was offering me a massive bribe funded by a dying company to purchase my silence. He wanted me to join the rot. "My consulting fee is already set, Everett," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any warmth. "And I have absolutely no interest in working for you." I turned my back on the chief operating officer, unlocked his office door, and walked out without looking back. It was exactly 9 in the morning. I approached the heavy double doors of the main boardroom. I took a slow, deep breath, adjusting my grip on my leather briefcase. Inside were the forensic files, the server logs, the audio transcripts, and the brutal mathematics of survival. I pushed the doors open and walked inside. The room was packed to capacity, yet suffocatingly quiet. The entire board of directors sat along the left side of the massive table, their faces tight with anticipation. The Granite Shore Credit Partners delegation, led by the piercing, analytical gaze of Celeste Rowan, occupied the right. An independent restructuring controller sat quietly at the far end, a legal notepad open in front of him. Everett and Nolan hurried in seconds behind me, taking their seats near the middle with forced, rigid postures. I did not sit down. I walked directly to the head of the table, claiming the exact spot Nolan had occupied 5 weeks ago. I connected my laptop to the central projection system. The massive screen behind me flickered to life. There was no Astron Fulfillment Systems logo on the screen. There was no corporate title slide boasting about synergy or resilience. The screen was stark white, bearing only a few elegant black words: Cook Recovery Advisory. Strategic Restructuring Proposal. It was a minor visual detail, but the psychological impact on the room was immediate and profound. The executives and the board members stared at the screen, realizing instantly that the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I was not a subordinate returning to save her former bosses. I was an independent authority, hired by the people who owned their corporate debt, and I had brought my own banner to the battlefield. I looked around the long table, making deliberate, unblinking eye contact with every single person in the room. I let the silence stretch for a long 10 seconds, building the pressure until it felt heavy enough to shatter the glass walls overlooking the city. "Good morning," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying no trace of the humiliation or anger I had suffered in this exact room. "We are here today to discuss the financial survival of this company. I have built a comprehensive operational model that can stabilize the cash flow within 90 days and satisfy the strictest loan covenants required by Granite Shore." I placed my hands flat on the polished wood, leaning forward just slightly. "However, before we discuss the solution," I continued, my words striking the silent room like a heavy gavel, "you need to know exactly what decisions dragged this company to the edge of bankruptcy. And more importantly, you need to know exactly who made them." I clicked the presentation forward, the high-definition projector casting a crisp blue light across the frozen faces of the executive team. The screen displayed the raw, undeniable metadata of the original recovery file. I took my time, speaking with slow, deliberate precision. I highlighted the exact creation date, stretching back 4 exhaustive months. I showed the board the log of thousands of micro-edits, every single one of them securely tied to my personal user identification. Then, I pulled up the exact version Nolan had submitted to the lending consortium. I placed them side by side. I traced the digital footprints showing exactly where the document had been duplicated, entirely scrubbed of my name, and fraudulently retitled. "This is not a matter of a manager simply forgetting to share the credit during a high-pressure meeting," I told the room, my voice echoing cleanly off the glass walls. "This is premeditated digital theft, executed precisely 12 hours before your crucial presentation." I clicked to the next slide, bringing up the operational matrices. "But the theft of intellectual property is actually the least of your problems today, because in order to cover their tracks and protect their own interests, they removed the most vital organ of the survival model. They deleted the mandatory liquidation of the Dallas North facility." I pulled up the unedited financial projections, the ones that proved the company was bleeding out. I showed them the brutal, unyielding mathematics. Dallas North was not a strategic differentiator, as Everett had consistently and proudly claimed to the board of directors. It was a massive financial sinkhole. I displayed the doctored inventory logs, proving the facility was artificially inflating its value by holding dead stock. I explained exactly how keeping it open guaranteed the collapse of the entire regional logistics network. The lead creditor from Granite Shore Credit Partners leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes locked onto Nolan. "Is this accurate, Nolan? Did you present a fundamentally broken financial model to this consortium while legally claiming to be its sole architect? Nolan gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. "I was merely representing a collective departmental effort," he stammered, his face flushing a dark, mottled red. "As the vice president of strategy, my role is to synthesize the data. I cannot be expected to know every single granular metric off the top of my head." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I simply pressed a key on my laptop. The audio recording from our final dry run filled the heavy silence of the boardroom. Nolan's own recorded voice echoed from the speakers, nervously asking me to give him a simple soundbite because he fundamentally did not understand the low-density metric he was about to present as his own genius. The silence that followed the end of the recording was absolute and suffocating. Nolan sank back into his luxurious leather chair, physically deflating. He covered his mouth with his hand, staring blankly at the table as his entire career evaporated in real time. Everett Dane, however, immediately tried to pivot. He possessed the survival instincts of a cornered rat. He sat up straight, adopting a look of grave, paternal disappointment. "This is clearly a catastrophic failure of middle management oversight," Everett said smoothly, looking directly at the lead investor. "I trusted Nolan to handle the technical delegation, and he clearly abused that trust to hide his own shortcomings. I take full responsibility for not auditing his claims more closely before we presented." "It was not an oversight, Everett," I countered instantly, cutting off his escape route. I pushed the final 2 documents onto the main screen. "It was a corrupt system you built, and it was a system you strictly enforced." The massive screen now displayed the internal email Everett had sent, explicitly excluding me from the private creditor dinner because I lacked the proper executive polish. Right next to it was the highly confidential fourth-quarter compensation draft. I used a red digital marker to underline the operational milestones, explicitly linking his massive 6-figure cash bonus to the continued, unjustified operation of Dallas North. "You did not fail to supervise Nolan," I said, looking directly into Everett's eyes. "You intentionally chose a compliant, technically illiterate mouthpiece who would not question why you were bleeding a billion-dollar company dry just to protect your own payout and your family members." Miriam Holt, the formidable chairperson of the board of directors, had been sitting quietly at the far end of the long table. Up until this exact moment, she had maintained a completely neutral, waiting posture. Now, she leaned forward, her face a mask of cold, terrifying fury. She realized in an instant that the board had been deliberately led by a fabricated portrait of competence for months. "This meeting is suspended," Miriam announced, her voice cutting through the tension like a steel whip. "Nolan, you are terminated effective immediately. Corporate security will escort you out of the building right now. Everett, you are placed on an immediate, unpaid administrative suspension pending a full forensic investigation by our outside legal counsel. Furthermore, all executive bonuses related to the Southwest Corridor are permanently frozen." She turned her sharp gaze directly to me. "Brianna, the board of directors formally accepts the original recovery framework you presented today. What are your terms for overseeing its immediate implementation?" "My firm will manage the transition under 3 absolute conditions," I replied, my tone unwavering. "First, Dallas North closes by the end of this month. Second, the current operational executive suite is completely restructured under creditor supervision. And third, every single strategic document moving forward must clearly and legally credit the technical architect who built it." Miriam nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. Agreed. The most beautiful retaliation. However, did not happen in that boardroom. It happened 8 months later. I never returned to Asteron Fulfillment Systems as an employee. I used my massive consulting fees and my newly cemented, bulletproof industry reputation to secure backing from 2 major financial partners. Together, we purchased a highly profitable Midwestern logistics cluster that Asteron had been forced to sell off at a discount during their painful restructuring phase. We rebranded the cluster, applied my unedited operational models, and turned it into a remarkably efficient, lucrative enterprise operating entirely under my own rules. I soon started receiving invitations to speak at national supply chain conferences and corporate leadership summits. I did not stand on those brightly lit stages as the sad woman who had her hard work stolen by a lazy colleague. I stood there as the chief executive who had taken a public humiliation and forged it into an unstoppable financial weapon. I became the expert who knew exactly how to dismantle a broken corporate machine and build a better one from the scrap metal. Sometimes, late at night, I look back at the precise moment I placed my plastic employee badge on that polished mahogany table. I realized then that the greatest, most defining decision of my life was not about destroying the men who tried to erase me. The greatest decision was forcing an entire corporate ecosystem to finally call my value by its true name. It was far too late for them to keep me, but it was exactly the right time for me to take everything that was rightfully mine. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below to share your location and your thoughts on how everything turned out. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hit the thanks button so this story can reach even more people who need to hear it.